Mafia boss walked in the park with his fiancée until he saw his ex playing happy with twins. Welcome back to Heartwoven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing well today. May your heart be light, your mind be calm, and may every story you watch here leave you a little stronger, a little wiser, and a little more inspired. I wrote today's story because sometimes love, truth, and fate collide in ways that leave us breathless, and I wanted to capture that raw human emotion, the kind that shakes us, makes us reflect, and challenges everything we think we know about loyalty, loss, and the choices we make. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single moment of this story. Every chapter has twists, hidden truths, and moments that will make you question what you would do if you were in their shoes. And when it ends, I really want to hear from you. Give your honest feedback and rate the story out of 10. So make sure to subscribe to Heartwoven Tales, and let's dive in. Harry had always believed parks were dishonest places. Too much green pushed into cities built on concrete and blood, too much laughter layered over lives that would unravel the moment people went home. Even as he walked through the wide paths and trimmed trees, his body refused to relax. 36 years had shaped him into a man who didn't blend into peace. Broad shoulders strained beneath a tailored coat, his movements controlled, economical like every step had been calculated in advance. Power had trained him this way. Power had taught him that open spaces were where mistakes happened, where threats didn't announce themselves. His eyes moved constantly, over benches, playgrounds, couples, shadows, cataloging exits, distances, possibilities. This was instinct, not paranoia. He didn't turn it off, even now. Jimmy walked beside him, her hand looped through his arm with practiced familiarity, her voice flowing as she spoke about wedding arrangements she'd clearly rehearsed in her head. She talked about colors that complemented the season, about a venue overlooking water, about guests who would feel honored to attend. Harry heard the sound of her words without absorbing their meaning. He nodded at the right moments, murmured agreement when her tone expected it, but his attention drifted the way it always did when the subject turned to a future he felt strangely absent from. Jimmy was beautiful, composed, raised in a world where outcomes were managed long before questions were asked. She fit beside him perfectly on paper. That was the problem. Paper never bled. The park was busy in the way families preferred, controlled chaos. Children ran without direction, their laughter sharp and unfiltered. Parents hovered close enough to intervene but far enough to pretend independence. Harry's gaze swept over them automatically until it didn't. The interruption came not from danger, but from sound. A laugh. Not loud, not forced, not polite. It was warm, unguarded, carrying something reckless and familiar that reached him before he could stop it. The impact was physical. His chest tightened as if something inside him had been struck and displaced. For a brief, disorienting moment, he forgot where he was, forgot who he was supposed to be. He turned toward the sound, expecting memory to correct itself, expecting his mind to reject what his senses suggested. Instead, he saw her. She was standing near the grass, knees bent as she chased two small boys who ran in uneven circles around her, their movements clumsy with joy. Her hair caught the light as she laughed again, bending to scoop one of them up before he escaped her reach. The sight rooted Harry to the ground. He knew the shape of that smile. He knew the rhythm of that laughter. He had memorized it once, then buried it under grief, so complete it nearly destroyed him. Liana. The name surfaced uninvited, sharp and impossible. 4.5 years ago, he had stood in a sterile room and identified her body. He remembered the smell of disinfectant, the unnatural stillness, the way he forced himself to look longer than any man should. He remembered convincing himself that the woman on the table was truly gone, because the alternative would have shattered him beyond repair. That moment had carved a permanent absence into his life, one he never spoke about, one he survived by turning colder, harder, more efficient. Liana was dead. She had to be. Yet here she was, alive in sunlight, kneeling to brush dirt from a child's knees with gentle impatience, her expression focused and tender in a way no performance could fake. One of the boys suddenly stopped running and looked up. His face turned toward Harry without curiosity, without fear, just instinct. The world narrowed to that single glance. Dark eyes, sharp and observant, set in a face too young to carry familiarity, yet unmistakable. Harry felt something inside him fracture. It wasn't recognition in the rational sense. It was deeper than that. Bone deep, blood deep. He had seen that gaze reflected back at him for decades, in mirrors, in old photographs, in moments when he barely recognized himself. The child tilted his head slightly, studying him, and Harry's breath stalled. This wasn't coincidence. Coincidences didn't feel like this. Jimmy noticed his stillness before she followed his gaze. Her words faltered, then stopped entirely as she traced the line of his attention across the park. She didn't understand what she was seeing at first, only that something had pulled Harry out of her orbit completely. Her fingers tightened around his arm, an unconscious attempt to anchor him. When her eyes landed on Liana, on the children, on the way Harry's face had drained of all color, a quiet dread settled in her stomach. She didn't know the story, not fully. She only knew that this moment was not meant to exist, and that whatever it was stronger than plans, stronger than promises. Harry stopped walking. The movement was so abrupt that Jimmy stumbled slightly beside him. His body refused to respond to time as it moved forward. Sound dulled. The park blurred at the edges. He wasn't standing beside his fiancée anymore. He was standing between past and present, between a truth he had accepted and one that now demanded acknowledgement. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to reclaim control. Yet he couldn't. Control required certainty, and certainty had just collapsed. His life had been built on the assumption that this woman was gone. That assumption had shaped everything that followed. Across the grass, Liana straightened slowly, the smile still on her face as she turned instinctively toward the direction of his gaze. Her eyes lifted, scanning the crowd, then they found him. The change was immediate and devastating. Joy vanished, replaced by shock so sharp it stole the air from her lungs. Her body reacted before her mind caught up, tension locking her shoulders, her hand tightening around the child nearest to her. For a single suspended second, the park held its breath. Two lives that were never supposed to intersect again stood facing each other, exposed, unprotected, and irrevocably seen. The past had not crept back quietly. It had stepped into the open and refused to be ignored. 2. Liana's smile didn't fade gradually. It collapsed. One moment her face was open, warm, alive in the way only people who believe they are safe can be, and the next it was as if something had been violently torn away from her. Her breath caught, her eyes widening just enough to betray shock before instinct took over. Fear didn't creep in. It slammed into her, cold and immediate. She moved without thinking, stepping forward and angling her body so that Harry disappeared from the twins' direct line of sight. Her hand tightened around one small shoulder, then the other, fingers digging in just enough to remind herself they were real, that they were here, that she still had something to protect. The park noise continued around them, oblivious, cruel in its normalcy. Harry watched the transformation with a hollow stillness that frightened even him. The way her posture changed, the way her eyes darted not toward him, but toward exits, toward space, toward escape. It confirmed what his mind had been resisting. This wasn't confusion on her face. It wasn't surprise alone. It was recognition layered with terror, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly who stands in front of you and what that person represents. His chest tightened again, not with grief this time, but with a different realization. Liana hadn't just survived. She had been hiding. From him, or from something that came with him, he couldn't yet tell. Liana. He said her name softly, almost carefully, as if raising his voice might fracture her into something unreachable. The sound felt foreign in his mouth, like a word from a language he hadn't spoken in years. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach out again. He simply said her name and let it exist between them, heavy with everything it carried. Years of silence, years of assumed loss, years of decisions made on a lie he hadn't known was one. Jimmy reacted sharply beside him, her grip tightening around his arm as reality lagged behind instinct. She shook her head once, then again, as if the movement alone could correct what she was seeing. Her voice came out tight, urgent, pitched low, but frantic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Liana had died. She remembered the funeral, the quiet conversations, the way Harry had gone distant afterward. Grief did strange things to people. Hallucinations, projections. That had to be it. She needed it to be. Because the alternative meant that her place beside him, her future, had been built on something rotten. But denial shattered under details logic couldn't explain. Liana's hands were shaking despite the way she tried to steady them. Her eyes never left Harry's face, even as she angled her body protectively. And the children, too young to understand, too perceptive to ignore, had gone still. One of the boys mirrored Harry's stance unconsciously, feet planted, shoulders squared, watching with a seriousness that didn't belong to childhood. The resemblance wasn't just physical anymore. It was behavioral. It was instinctive. Harry saw it, and this time he didn't look away. He took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, careful not to startle her. His hand lifted, palm open, an old reflex stripped of authority and threat. He barely brushed her wrist, the contact light enough to question whether it had happened at all. Liana flinched violently. She jerked back as if struck, dragging the children with her, her breath coming fast now, shallow and panicked. The reaction cut deeper than words could have. Whatever existed between them in the past, love, trust, shared history, had been replaced by something far more dangerous, fear rooted in experience. She didn't speak. There was no accusation, no explanation, no confrontation, just a decision. Liana turned sharply, pulling the twins close as she moved, her head down, her steps quick and purposeful. She weaved into the crowd with practiced precision, choosing paths where strollers and families created obstacles, where visibility broke down, where pursuit would draw attention. This wasn't improvisation. This was habit. Harry watched her disappear piece by piece, hair, coat, the flash of a child's shoe, until the space where she'd stood felt violently empty. Jimmy inhaled sharply, her fingers loosening from Harry's arm as she realized he hadn't followed. He stood completely still, his face unreadable, his gaze locked on the last point where Liana had vanished. For a heartbeat, she thought he might collapse or explode. Instead, something colder settled over him. His jaw tightened. His breathing evened out. The man who survived chaos by mastering it resurfaced, not in rage but in control. He lifted his hand slightly, not looking back as he spoke into the concealed calm at his collar. His voice was calm, dangerously so, issuing instructions that rippled outward through unseen channels. Seal the park. No panic, no visible force. Eyes only. Track exits, cameras, faces, routes. This wasn't about catching a fleeing woman. This was about understanding how a dead person had learned to run so well. Jimmy stared at him, the weight of what was happening finally crashing through her defenses. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't grief. This was history resurrected, complicated by children and fear and secrets she didn't have access to. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, to reclaim certainty. But nothing came out. For the first time since she'd known him, Harry felt unreachable. As the park continued its afternoon rhythm, children laughing, parents chatting, lives unfolding without interruption, Harry stood at the center of something that had been stolen from him and hidden in plain sight. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't fate. Someone had engineered this absence. Someone had decided he didn't deserve the truth. And now that the truth had looked back at him and run, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. It wouldn't stay hidden again. The world around Harry seemed to slow in the hours that followed, though nothing had actually changed. The park's normal rhythm persisted, the distant echo of children's laughter, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the late afternoon breeze, but he could no longer hear it. His mind had begun cataloging, analyzing, demanding confirmation for something that should have been impossible. A woman he had mourned, believed dead, alive in the same city, with children who bore his DNA. Every thought that tried to distract him, the wedding, Jimmy, the empire he managed, dropped away, leaving only a sharp, empty focus that burned through every other priority. He started with surveillance. Cameras, both obvious and covert, mapped every step she had taken in the park that day. Her movements precise, intentional, yet casual enough to avoid detection. Every angle corroborated the impossible. Timing, positioning, interactions, it all aligned. The footage didn't lie. Neither did the subtle gestures. The way she held the twins' hands, the cautious glances over her shoulder, the calculated avoidance of anyone who might recognize her. Everything screamed that this had been planned, executed, and concealed with care. The clarity of it was like cold steel pressed against the back of his skull. Next came the medical records. What he found there twisted the knife further. Hospital admissions that didn't exist in public databases, procedures masked as routine, documents altered by hands he did not yet know. Each file carried the faint, deliberate mark of someone who had anticipated scrutiny. Liana had been erased from every system, replaced by an absence that appeared natural. A death certificate, a record of an accident, each falsified with precision. It wasn't chance. It wasn't circumstance. It was calculated. Someone had stripped her from the world as thoroughly as if she had never drawn breath, and she had survived. DNA testing was the final proof, brutal in its simplicity. The samples arrived, small clinical vials that should have meant nothing, and then the result, undeniable. The twins were his sons. That knowledge did not thrill him, did not bring warmth or reunion. Instead, it cut into him with surgical accuracy. Years stolen, memories he could never reclaim, moments that had vanished, opportunities lost before they had begun. He saw every day he had spent believing she was gone as a lie, one that had been carefully threaded into his life by invisible hands. The grief returned, but not the one he had known before. This grief was sharp, precise, and filled with rage disguised as silence. Jimmy watched him in those moments, her presence like an echo against the wall of his private unraveling. She had stood beside him through countless crises, but she had never seen this side of him. The man who handled threats with effortless dominance now moved through space like a ghost, still, controlled, yet fractured internally. She understood finally that her claim to the future he was building with her had never existed. She'd been living in borrowed time, proximity, and convenience, while the true narrative had been elsewhere, somewhere hidden, waiting to reemerge. And now it had. Harry didn't shout. He didn't smash anything. There was no explosion of violence, no theatrical demonstration of anger. His silence carried its own gravity, a quiet that made those around him, men who had once feared him without thought, pause, question, and even fear. In that silence lay the full weight of betrayal, of years erased, of the truth confronting him more aggressively than any enemy ever could. It was a calculated storm, one that left him untouched on the surface, yet reshaping the ground beneath him with every breath. For hours he reviewed every scrap of evidence, every document, every movement, every irregularity. His eyes scanned maps, memorized routes, noted exit strategies, calculated contingencies. He didn't allow distraction. He didn't allow panic. He didn't allow himself to acknowledge that what he felt, grief, longing, rage, disbelief, was entirely justified. His mind reduced the problem to its core. She was alive. The twins were his. Someone had stolen 4.5 years of life from him. That was the equation he needed to solve before anything else mattered. When the time came to act, it was methodical. Guards dismissed, communications minimized, security protocols temporarily suspended so that he could move alone, unobserved, toward the locus of the truth. He memorized the address, the route, the potential obstacles. Every detail had been considered, every contingency accounted for. This wasn't a mission for power. This wasn't about vengeance, though it burned quietly beneath the surface. This was about truth. He needed to see the woman he had buried alive, the children who carried pieces of him without knowing it, and understand precisely what had happened, why it had happened, and who had orchestrated it. The city's familiar streets felt alien under his careful stride. Windows reflected his image back at him, a man walking purposefully through lives, unaware of the consequences lurking just ahead. Each pedestrian, each car, each passerby was a variable in a delicate equation he intended to solve without error. His body remained relaxed, betraying nothing of the maelstrom inside, but every sense was sharpened. Sounds carried significance. Shadows hinted at potential threats. The park had been the spark, but the fire was waiting elsewhere. By the time he reached the building, Harry had reconstructed the past in his mind in meticulous detail. Every missed phone call, every absence explained itself in retrospect. Manipulation, erasure, calculation. It had all led to this moment. There was no turning back. He pressed the buzzer with steady hands, heart not racing but unyielding. His mind cataloged exits, probable responses, defensive measures. He was a hunter confronting prey, but prey that was also, in some essential way, a mirror of himself. And when the door opened, he would have to face not only her, but the consequences of every day he had been blind. The truth was waiting on the other side. Harry's footsteps carried him to the door, each one measured, deliberate, unflinching. He had memorized every street, every corner, every shadow. Yet the final approach felt different, heavier, as though the weight of years stolen compressed the air around him. The building was unremarkable to anyone else, neutral in tone, a house blending into anonymity. But to him, it had become the epicenter of everything lost, everything hidden, everything that had taken the life he thought he had lived. When he pressed the buzzer, the hum of the city outside faded, replaced by the quiet tension of inevitability. He waited, not with patience, but with the certainty that nothing on the other side could undo the truth he already knew. The door opened abruptly, a slam caught mid-motion, and for a split second, everything froze. Liana's eyes widened in recognition, and the motion to shut the door became instinctive, urgent. She leaned forward, her hand striking against the frame, a barricade she hoped would shield her and the children. But Harry's palm met hers with gentle precision, stopping the motion without force, without aggression, just presence. His eyes locked on hers, hollow, raw, carrying the cumulative weight of grief and disbelief, exhaustion and determination. They weren't angry, not yet, not overtly. They were alive with the truth, and that alone terrified her more than any fist or gun ever could. The twins, small and unassuming in the periphery, froze. They had felt the shift in the room, the gravity of something larger than them settling like a storm overhead. Their tiny hands gripped the edges of a sofa as if it were a lifeline, eyes wide and unblinking, measuring the figure who had appeared from nowhere and yet belonged in a way they could not comprehend. Liana's voice faltered for the first time in months, a whisper tight with fear, soft but sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. "Harry, you shouldn't be here," she said, her words trembling. "Please, just leave." Every syllable was wrapped in urgency, layered with years of self-preservation. But underneath it was a plea he could not ignore, a recognition that he had the power to destroy what she had spent years building, whether by intention or accident. Harry dropped to his knees, not in surrender, but in the collapse of everything he had held inside. His spine bowed under the invisible weight of grief and loss, the culmination of years pretending that absence was acceptance. The room smelled of everyday life, laundry and faint perfume, toys scattered with quiet disorder. But nothing could mask the intensity of what had just unfolded. He reached for her, hesitated, then spoke, voice breaking in its rarity. "I mourned you every day. I died slowly, believing you were gone, believing nothing of this would ever exist again." His words were not accusatory, not demanding, but full of unspoken sorrow that lingered in the air between them. Liana recoiled slightly, shaking her head as if denying his presence could dissolve reality. She spoke faster, breath catching, trying to create distance through words and explanations, through fear itself. "Harry, you don't understand. You can't be here. If they see you, if anyone knows you, everything I've built, everything I've survived, will collapse. You don't know what it took to get here." Her eyes darted toward the shadows beyond the room, toward doors that led to safety, to windows that could be watched, to streets where eyes might observe. Men she would never name, threats she could only allude to. They existed just beyond the veil, and every instinct screamed that Harry's arrival had shifted the balance dangerously. Harry's mind cataloged it all with clinical precision, yet his heart remained raw. He understood her fear, understood that she had survived by mastering it, but he also knew this wasn't coincidence. Her life had been meticulously arranged, protected by those who controlled more than he had yet traced. He pressed for details, each question measured, patient yet insistent. "Who? What? Why? Tell me, Liana, I need to know." But her lips sealed against the truth. Terror wrapped itself around her words and twisted them into silence. She would not betray her survival. She could not. The twins remained still, observing the silent war between two adults whose history was invisible to them, but palpable in every heartbeat. One of the boys glanced at Harry, and for a fleeting moment recognition flickered. Something subconscious, something instinctive that transcended explanation. Liana's hands moved to shield them instinctively, drawing them closer, holding them as though her grip alone could protect them from the storm she felt encroaching. Harry noted every gesture, every twitch, every involuntary reaction, storing it with the precision of someone who had built his empire on understanding weakness and reading intention. Outside, in the shadows that stretched along the perimeter of the property, someone waited. Patient, powerful, unseen but unmistakable. The watcher did not move. There was no signal, no vibration, only the knowledge that every step, every hesitation, every fragment of dialogue was being catalogued. Harry did not yet see them, but he felt the presence, sensed it in the sudden tightening of the air, in the imperceptible pause between Liana's words, in the subtle way the children tensed. The house had become not only a refuge, but a theater, and they were all part of a script written by unseen hands. Before the door closed completely, Liana's voice emerged in a whisper, barely audible yet heavy with meaning. "Walker." The single name landed like a detonator, exploding into the space around them. Harry's eyes narrowed, the calm he had cultivated over years replaced with sharp clarity. He understood, finally, the architect of the years stolen, the life erased, the absence he had endured. Everything that had happened, the accident, the erasure, the silence, was no random cruelty. It had been designed, executed, controlled by one name, one person, Walker. A pause lingered, thick and suffocating, as the door remained ajar, swinging slightly under the faint wind. The twins blinked, caught between curiosity and fear. Liana pressed a finger to her lips, signaling restraint even as the name had unmoored every safety she had tried to maintain. Harry's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his knees, though outwardly he remained on his knees, controlled and deliberate. Outside, the shadow waited, patient as stone, while inside, history and present collided with irreversible force. And in that moment, Harry realized that understanding who had destroyed his life was only the beginning. The moment Harry left the house, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of truths too long hidden. Each step he took toward Walker's office was deliberate, controlled, but beneath that discipline, a storm raged. Every memory of the past, the absence, the lies, the silent years of mourning, pulsed behind his temples. His fists clenched and unclenched almost unconsciously. The city around him moved with its usual casual indifference, unaware that one man was about to collide with the architect of lives stolen, of innocence shattered, of power abused. The streets seemed to shrink, compressing his focus onto one inevitable point. Walker had been the hand that orchestrated everything, and now Harry intended to confront it directly. He arrived without warning, the office door swinging open before a receptionist could protest, before security could react. The space was sterile, corporate, deceptively calm, but the tension immediately shifted the atmosphere. Walker sat behind the desk, body relaxed, posture casual, hands resting on polished wood as if expecting this confrontation. His eyes flicked up when Harry entered, the faintest smile curling over a face that had seen everything and believed itself untouchable. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the confidence of a man who had spent decades ensuring that consequences could be distributed selectively. Harry's expression remained unreadable, trained over years to mask the smallest hint of intent, but the energy in the room shifted immediately. He moved toward Walker, the air around him taut, the faint scent of leather and aftershave mixed with unspoken menace. His voice was quiet even, but every word carried a weight that made the walls seem to contract. Why? It wasn't the first question that had ever crossed his mind, but it was the only one that mattered now. Walker leaned back, arms stretching across the desk, letting the weight of calm arrogance fill the space between them. And then he spoke, slowly, methodically, no hesitation, no regret. He admitted it all: the accident, the false death, the erased identities, the meticulous planning that had forced Harry into a marriage with Jimmy. Every manipulation had been designed to cement control over the empire, to remove Harry from the equation at the precise moments that mattered. Each admission landed like a strike, each word confirming that every instinct Harry had ever trusted about loyalty, power, and control had been weaponized against him. Walker's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and amusement. The first blow wasn't physical. It was the mental assault of comprehension. Harry felt the air shift, felt the years he had mourned as carefully cultivated absence transform into outrage. And then instinct overrode restraint. Rage, explosive and pure, surged through his body. He moved without hesitation, closing the distance in a heartbeat. His fists struck the desk first, shattering the veneer of calm. Walker didn't flinch, didn't attempt to parry. He simply absorbed the initial force as if expecting it. But the next movement was slower, controlled, precise. Harry's body, trained for violence, became the instrument of years of frustration. Fists landed with a deliberate brutality, each strike punctuated by the memory of stolen moments, lost children, stolen time. Blood spilled, not just from Walker, but from the space itself. The polished wood reflected it in irregular streaks, marking the floor like the evidence of history's violence. Walker laughed through the broken edges of his teeth, the sound discordant, mocking, alive. "You think power fears fists?" he spat. "It doesn't. It fears nothing that walks. It fears only systems, silence, and consequences. And you, my friend, are still learning which consequences matter. Each word was a needle, designed to wound in ways that physical strikes could not. Harry's fists froze mid-air for the first time since the assault began, recognition cutting sharper than anger. Walker wasn't bluffing. He had constructed every obstacle, every safeguard, every absence with precision, and the consequences he referenced weren't abstract. If Harry reached for Liana, for the twins, for truth in any visible way, it wasn't his life that would bear the cost. It would be theirs. Every instinct, every ounce of protective instinct, every shred of human attachment screamed at him to pause. He did. Not out of fear for himself, but out of the visceral understanding that brute force could no longer win. Force alone would finish what Walker had started. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Walker's chest rose and fell, his grin lingering in a way that refused to be diminished. Harry's breathing, steady despite the storm inside, became the only audible marker of tension. Around them, the office seemed to shrink, walls closing in with the weight of unspoken knowledge, every surface reflecting a story of control and manipulation. He did not retreat, not in the slightest, yet the first strategic step had been taken. He restrained himself. The restraint was itself a weapon, a message to Walker that he understood, that he was aware, that this game would no longer be played on Walker's terms alone. Jimmy, distant but present, heard everything. Every confession, every admission, every calculated threat that Walker had laid out. She had positioned herself as a witness, not sure if she wanted to intervene, afraid of the consequences, yet compelled to see the full scope of the man she had aligned herself with. Every word reshaped her understanding of Harry, of herself, of the fragile architecture of power that had dominated them all. What she understood in that moment was both terrifying and clarifying. Control was never about the person in front of you. It was always about what they could do to those you loved. Harry's gaze, steady, unwavering, bore into Walker as if willing the truth into submission. Every line of his body, every subtle tightening of muscle, every controlled exhalation communicated understanding. He knew the risk. He knew the stakes. But he also knew that brute rage, untempered by strategy, would only extend Walker's reach, would only deepen the price to be paid. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Harry understood the nature of power in its purest, most insidious form. It was never owned by fists, by threats, by fear. It was owned by systems, by leverage, by patient, invisible control. Walker, sensing the shift, leaned back slightly, relaxed again, yet his eyes betrayed calculation. He had set every condition, known every reaction, and yet even he had not fully accounted for Harry's depth of patience, of strategy, of restraint. For a moment the room became a chessboard, each man positioning pieces unseen, every breath a calculated move, every glance a declaration of intent. The threat was clear. Touch Liana, touch the children, and Walker's systems would respond with surgical cruelty. Harry stepped back slowly, measuredly. His fists relaxed, but the tension in his body did not dissipate. He understood what Walker had done, why and how far the consequences could reach, and yet he walked away, not broken, not defeated, not beaten, restrained, yes, but aware that the game had changed. That understanding, that insight, that recognition of the true price of power had shifted him from impulsive force to controlled purpose. Outside the office, the city continued unaware. Pedestrians moved, traffic flowed, life proceeded without pause. Inside, the echoes of admission, confrontation, and revelation lingered, shaping the paths of everyone present. Jimmy's mind processed it all, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one who had just walked into her understanding of the world. And as Harry disappeared from sight, the faintest trace of calculated menace remained, invisible but indelible. The storm had passed, but the consequences would not. Walker had admitted everything, and Harry had absorbed it all. The true reckoning, the one that would define future action, had only begun. 6. The moment Harry left Walker's office, the weight of what had just occurred followed him like a shadow. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, not because of physical strain, but because of the invisible chains of betrayal, stolen time, and manipulated lives. Jimmy watched him retreat from the confrontation, and for the first time, she understood the full extent of what he had endured. The man she loved, or thought she did, was unraveling in ways she had avoided facing, suppressing truths too frightening to acknowledge. His silence, once a shield, now radiated a different kind of intensity, the quiet that precedes total collapse, and she realized that love could not be wrenched from someone through loyalty or coercion. For days, she avoided him, afraid of witnessing his disintegration firsthand, yet incapable of turning completely away. Every time she caught sight of him, there was a tremor in the air around him, subtle but undeniable, as if he carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions. She saw it in the hollow set of his eyes, in the slight tremor of his hands when they were momentarily idle, in the quiet exhalation that seemed to release years of suppressed grief. His empire, his power, his reputation, all of it remained intact to outsiders, but Jimmy saw the fractures beneath the polished surface, and they terrified her. Finally, she made her choice. She could remain passive, remain complicit, remain silent, and continue to pretend that she was a part of the life he had been forced to live, or she could act. She chose action. Alone, without protection, without the armor of pride or entitlement, she sought out Liana. Each step toward the woman who had been the center of Harry's world, the mother of his children, was deliberate, measured, yet charged with the uncertainty of what awaited. When Liana opened the door and saw Jimmy standing there, hesitant, anxious, apologetic, the first flicker of surprise crossed her face. "I need to speak with you," Jimmy began, voice low, careful, trembling slightly. "Alone." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of admission, accountability, and urgency. She had no right to be here, no right to claim space in Liana's life, and yet she stood firm, hoping her presence could bridge a gap wrought with pain, misunderstanding, and years of manipulation. Liana studied her, eyes guarded, lips pressed together, weighing intention against experience. Jimmy could feel the scrutiny, but she did not flinch. She had waited too long to act. "I'm sorry," she continued, her words breaking slightly under the weight of guilt she had carried for too long. "For my father, for what he's done, for everything I've done or failed to do." She paused, searching for recognition, for understanding, for some acknowledgement that her honesty might not be met with hostility. "And I'm sorry to you, Liana, for thinking I could love Harry enough to justify actions I now know would destroy lives. I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't honest enough." Each word was measured, deliberate, vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to be. Liana's eyes softened slightly, the first crack in her armor visible only because the apology arrived without pretense. She did not speak, did not react immediately, only observed the sincerity in Jimmy's gaze. There was no entitlement, no attempt to assert power, no expectation of forgiveness, just accountability. That alone made Liana pause, unprepared for its simplicity. Jimmy continued, carefully laying bare her intentions. "I will expose Walker. I will dismantle the systems he's used to control everyone. No one should live under his shadow. No one should endure the manipulation, the lies, the violence." The words were not a promise to Harry. They were not a claim to Liana. They were a declaration to the world that truth mattered more than desire, more than proximity, more than the fragile illusions that had governed the past. Liana felt something inside her shift. For years, she had carried the weight of fear and secrecy, of controlling appearances to survive. Now, for the first time in memory, someone had chosen honesty over convenience, action over self-preservation, and it fractured her simultaneously with relief. Tears, long restrained and unclaimed, began to fall. Liana let them, letting the exhaustion of years pour from her in a torrent, unanticipated but entirely necessary. She cried not just for the fear, not just for the lost time, not just for Harry, but for herself, for the moments she had denied, for the life she had hidden to survive. Each tear was both release and reclamation, a mark that the weight she had carried alone could finally be shared. Jimmy watched quietly, from a respectful distance, her presence steady but unobtrusive. She had arrived not to comfort, not to claim, but to witness. And in that act, she gave Liana permission to exist fully once again. Evidence leaked gradually, methodically, as Jimmy had promised. Names, alliances, transactions, all meticulously documented and exposed. Walker's empire, once untouchable, began to fracture under scrutiny, the systems of fear and control unraveling in response to the truths brought into the light. Those who had hidden behind loyalty, threats, and manipulation were forced to reckon with exposure. Slowly, irrevocably, the structures that had enforced silence and absence collapsed, leaving only remnants of the lives Walker had sought to dominate. Harry, operating in parallel, observed the results without interference. He held his sons for the first time, physically connecting with the children who bore pieces of him, pieces stolen and restored in equal measure. The weight of time lost, the years of absence, the invisible walls of control, all began to dissolve as he felt the undeniable reality of their presence. Their small hands, their trust, their instinctive attachment filled the void he had carried in silence. He did not speak. He did not promise. He simply held them, and that act alone became a testament to endurance, resilience, and the reclamation of what had been taken. Jimmy walked away quietly, not from failure, not from fear, but from understanding. Possession had never been her goal. Truth had been. By stepping aside, by allowing Harry to exist fully with Liana and the children, she honored the integrity of choice, of agency, of autonomy. She did not claim victory. She did not demand acknowledgement. She simply chose to leave, knowing that some forms of love are defined not by possession, but by release. Freedom arrived, quiet, unheralded, almost imperceptible, but tangible in every life it touched. Liana, exhausted and exposed, began to reconstruct the boundaries of her life, no longer operating solely in survival. Harry, present and silent, allowed his grief, his absence, and his love to coexist without interference. And Jimmy, having released her own attachment, understood the subtle truth that the greatest acts of courage often go unseen. Yet beneath the calm, beneath the reclaimed agency and exposed empire, a residual tension lingered. Healing had begun, but the work of rebuilding trust, of re-establishing boundaries, and of confronting the invisible wounds inflicted over years would demand patience, persistence, and resilience. Each character standing at the threshold of newfound freedom faced the realization that liberation was only the first step. And somewhere, in the quiet aftermath of revelation and confrontation, the story paused, not for resolution, but for the unspoken acknowledgement that while chains had been broken, the scars remained. Every decision, every release, every act of courage carried consequences yet to be understood. Freedom had arrived. Healing had just begun. 7. The city seemed quieter after Walker's fall. The invisible chains of fear that had ruled so many lives had finally been severed, and though the streets carried their usual hum of daily chaos, a strange calm lingered, almost imperceptible, like the air after a storm that has passed but left the world subtly altered. Harry walked through it without weapons, without guards, without the constant hum of surveillance or threat that had dictated his every move for years. His body, trained for confrontation, carried a new weight, a softness learned from necessity rather than choice. Each step was deliberate, measured, unhurried, yet filled with purpose. He was learning slowly how to exist in a life where control no longer demanded aggression, where protection could coexist with vulnerability. At home, the twins were everywhere, small and curious, full of the energy that comes from children too young to understand the intricacies of fear, manipulation, or power. They followed him from room to room, their tiny hands brushing against his legs, their laughter light, unrestrained, echoing through spaces that had once been hollow with absence. Harry did not direct them, did not command them, did not assert authority beyond simple guidance. He observed them, learned them, responded with patience, and in doing so, discovered the quiet satisfaction of presence over power. Each bedtime routine, each story read aloud, each small victory of trust became a measure of his growth, a redemption of time once stolen. Liana watched from the periphery, her own heart learning to breathe again. Fear, that old persistent shadow, still lingered in corners of her mind, a reflex of survival honed over years of hiding, manipulation, and careful calculation. Yet with each passing day, it loosened its grip. She observed Harry not as the man she had once feared losing, nor as the distant figure of power she had mourned, but as the man who had endured, who had persisted, who now stood beside her children with a quiet strength that required no violence to be felt. Trust rebuilt itself in increments, subtle and almost imperceptible, a glance here, a gesture there, laughter shared without hesitation, the silence that could finally exist without threat. The twins accepted him in a way that was instinctive rather than learned. One evening, a small hand reached for his, tentative but confident, and called him Papa with a voice unburdened by history, unaware of the weight carried in that word, yet somehow intuitively recognizing it as right. Harry's chest tightened, not with triumph, but with quiet reverence. He understood that love was not claimed through possession, nor earned through dominance. It emerged naturally, organically, when absence, manipulation, and fear had been stripped away, and what remained was truth, patience, and consistency. This was the lesson he had learned through years of pain, that love survives not through coercion, but through endurance and authenticity. One evening, as the sun dipped low, spilling amber light across the park where he had first lost and found everything, Liana stepped forward and reached for his hand first. No hesitation, no calculation, no expectation, simply choice. The world was quiet, the shadows gone, the specters of threat dissipated. Children ran in the distance, parents watched without concern, and the ordinary life around them hummed without intrusion. In that simple act, the reconciliation of years, the restoration of trust, and the emergence of a life reclaimed were all quietly affirmed. They did not need words. Their hands, entwined, said more than any confession could. Love had endured, untouched by deception, untethered from the constraints of power, and allowed to exist in its truest form. Harry did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he demand it. His presence, his consistency, his unwavering patience were the only proof he needed to offer. Liana, for her part, did not ask for it either. Forgiveness was neither requested nor necessary, because what had been lost had been reclaimed through presence, care, and the subtle work of rebuilding a foundation stronger than any force could destroy. Trust was earned not in words, but in repeated actions, in quiet moments that carried significance greater than any declaration. Together, they moved forward not as saviors or victims, but as survivors, each learning to navigate the remnants of pain while embracing the possibilities of life restored. Beyond their personal reconciliation, the world had begun to adjust. Walker's empire, once untouchable, had collapsed under scrutiny, exposing the consequences of manipulation, greed, and unchecked power. Alliances dissolved, systems failed, and those who had built control through fear were forced to reckon with accountability. Harry, Liana, and Jimmy watched from their separate vantage points as the structures of oppression fell, and in those moments the magnitude of human agency became evident. The story was no longer about revenge, nor about power. It was about truth and the enduring force of choices made with integrity. The moral revealed itself slowly, not as a lecture, but as the lived experience of every character. Real love does not rely on dominance, does not bend to threats, and does not survive on fear. It thrives on honesty, consistency, patience, and the courage to endure, even when the world conspires against it. Love, when true, does not need rescue or rescue attempts. It simply endures, quietly, powerfully, irrevocably. Those who had wielded control through coercion had failed because they misunderstood this truth. Harry had survived, not because of his fists, his fear, or his empire, but because he remained present, steadfast, and willing to endure. Liana had survived because she persisted, trusted selectively, and chose the path of authenticity over survival alone. In the park, their hands remained entwined, the twins running freely ahead, and for the first time in years, the air was unburdened by lies, threats, or shadows. The lessons of the past had not been erased, but they had been transformed into wisdom. Power without truth could not protect, could not sustain, and could not heal. The only enduring force was honesty, patience, and the unyielding choice to act from the heart rather than the hand of control. In that space, both literal and symbolic, the characters understood what it meant to live fully again. The final realization was simple yet profound. Freedom was not the absence of challenge. Healing was not the absence of scars. Love was not measured in triumph or conquest, but in persistence, in willingness to stand and stay, to bear witness, and to allow truth to guide every choice. The world around them could continue in chaos, uncertainty, and imbalance. But within this small sphere of reclaimed life, the fundamental human truths held: love endures, trust is rebuilt, and power is meaningless without accountability. And as the sun disappeared completely beyond the horizon, painting the city in twilight, Harry, Liana, and the twins walked together, hand in hand, grounded, steady, and ready to face whatever future might come. Not through domination, not through coercion, but through truth, patience, and the quiet strength of love that had survived every lie, every shadow, and every threat. Final moral for the audience. Real love doesn't survive because of power, revenge, or control. It survives because it is rooted in truth, patience, and endurance. In a world of manipulation and shadows, only honesty and courage can reclaim lives, restore trust, and allow love to exist unbroken. The measure of human connection is not in what we conquer, but in what we are willing to endure for the sake of truth. And so Harry, Liana, and the twins walked into a future built on truth, patience, and love that had endured every shadow. Their story reminds us that real love doesn't rely on power or fear. It survives because it is honest, consistent, and fearless. If this story moved you, made you feel every heartbeat, or reminded you of the strength in enduring love, don't forget to subscribe to Heartwoven Tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what part of Harry and Liana's journey touched you the most. Your feedback shapes every story we tell. Stay with us for more tales that pull at your heart, challenge your mind, and remind you why truth and love are the most powerful forces of all.